started with that video because I think, like Kathy aptly said, it shows the friendship. And like we talked about yesterday with Robeson, it's figures like Paul Robeson and Du Bois in particular who built friendship at the height of anti-communism. And what could build, like King said, a world house for humanity. Well, we're going to take a few seconds to set up for the panels, but then I would love to welcome our first panel of 3 panels today, titled "The World Progressive Forces Respond to the New China," which will be moderated by Brandon Doe. And I would also like to welcome the panelists, Alice Lee, Untitled Yi, and Purba Chatterjee.
Greetings, everyone. I would first like to thank the organizing committee of the Saturday Free School and the Saturday Free School for organizing, and the Church of the Advocate for also providing the space for this event. What I want to focus on in my introduction is to provide the framework for our fellow panelists and the presenters, but also to emphasize that this is not just a panel which celebrates the accomplishments of China or celebrating the rise of Asia, but we are trying to understand the motive and the drive behind these accomplishments. In 2015, at the African Asian Summit in Jakarta, Indonesia, President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China proposed the carrying forward of the spirit of the Bandung Conference, which exemplified the unity of Africa and Asia to struggle for a better world. After centuries of humiliation, poverty, and war, the majority of Asia is striving toward a new future and working to create it, with China playing a major role in the forward progress of these nations. The civilizations and the people who courageously stood up to the West are emerging from the darkness of the past. We are seeing the revival of these relationships that not only stretch back to the anti-colonial movement, but beyond a millennia of civilizational ties. It is becoming clearer to see that as the Western world is collapsing, the ideals of a common brotherhood between all of humanity and a common destiny are superseding the contempt for human life that was pervasive by the imperialists who waged wars across Asia and Africa. The partitions that divided people by their ethnicities, religions, or nation states are becoming a thing of the past. A new vision for humanity is being born. The Black revolutionary James Baldwin writes, "What the mass culture in America really reflects is the American bewilderment in the face of the world we live in. We do not seem to want to know that we are in the world, that we are subjected to the same catastrophes, vices, joys, and follies which have baffled and afflicted mankind for ages. We in America must realize that this vision does not exclude us, but that we are inextricably tied to it. To see ourselves as part of the world and to join the struggle for peace is our inescapable responsibility. We can make the commitment to realize the possibility for this vision in America and fight pessimism with faith. Faith that if our brothers and sisters in Asia are rising out of the depths of chaos, so can we. When we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, we also celebrate the great anti-colonial tradition which produced the moral leadership that cemented the foundations on which Asia's rise is standing firmly upon today. We are not simply celebrating the accomplishments of the movement, but the spirit which made these accomplishments possible. We are looking to China as a model for the future and as an exemplar of how we can grow into new men and women who will cultivate and build a greater world. In our first panel of the day titled, World Progressive Forces Respond to the New China, we will be engaging in a dialogue that examines China's relationship to the rising people of the world. As the world transitions into a new historical moment, one that prioritizes the spiritual and material needs of human beings and seeks to solve its problems not through the use of weapons, but instead through mutual cooperation and principled unity. First, I would like to welcome Alice Lee, who is a member of the Saturday Free School, who will be talking about and discussing the significance of W.E.B. Du Bois's trip to China in 1959.
Good morning, everyone. As part of the panel, I'll be presenting on Du Bois in China and build upon Kathy's introduction and the video of Du Bois's trip to China in 1959. Du Bois had traveled extensively. Aside from China, he had also been to Germany, England, France, and the Soviet Union. Rooted in the Black freedom struggle, he sought world programs of economic, political, and social change that might inform the revolution needed in America, for America in the early 20th century, as it is now, was a country plagued with war, racism, and poverty. Du Bois first saw China during a one-week trip in 1936. The China he had seen in 1936 was one divided and occupied by foreign imperialist powers and had reduced China to a semi-colonial country. China's subjugation and humiliation was a result of a history going back to the Opium Wars during the early and mid-19th century, during which opium was violently thrusted upon its society. By demarcating boundaries, claiming rights to seaports and railways, and pouring loans and investments into China, foreign countries such as Japan and the United States commanded China's industries and markets and reaped immense profits. All the while, China's masses were deeply impoverished, with little to no say over the wages, prices, and taxes dictated by imperialist interests. When he returned in 1959, Du Bois saw a different China, a new China, one that was, as we have discussed in the previous days of our events, led by the Communist Party of China and built for its masses of peasants and workers. Given an ideology, a program, and arms, the people had stood up. During his 10 weeks, Du Bois witnessed China on a level of breadth and depth rarely experienced. He traveled 5,000 miles by railway, boats, plane, and automobile. He went to universities, factories, villages, theaters, tea parlors, and people's homes. He met with and conversed with China's many leaders, both national and local, who are guiding the new nation systems of government, industry, education, and culture. He also met some of the many workers who made up the nation and were carrying out its tremendous reconstruction. Du Bois saw the spirit and lives of the Chinese people in work and in leisure, with their friends and with their families. Of his trip, Du Bois wrote in his essay, The Vast Miracle of China Today, quote, I have traveled widely on this earth since my first trip to Europe 67 years ago. Save South America and India, I have seen most of the civilized world and much of its backward regions. Many leading nations I have visited repeatedly, but I have never seen a nation which so amazed and touched me as China in 1959. How was Du Bois able to understand China during a time when there was such intense anti-communist sentiment, when New China was still an infant and still so poor? First, because of his understanding of democracy and therefore China's contribution to the world. And this is not the democracy that we envision in the West, where each person has a single vote. Du Bois writes in his unpublished manuscript, A World Search for Democracy, quote, real democracy is based upon the widest recognition of human equality. It assumes that wisdom in government comes from the widest knowledge concerning the governed. A knowledge eventually so wide that it becomes in effect a pool of human experience to which all human beings contribute. Shut off one rill from this ocean of human life, and it is incomplete. But when it is all there, despite its waves and storms, the sheltered inlets and hidden rocks, it becomes for the guiding of men the voice of God. End quote. Du Bois saw that China was rid of emperors, warlords, and imperialists after a century of exploitation, and the people were toiling not for the few, but for the broad masses of their own country. The Communist Party of China had built a democratic people's movement and mobilized the masses through the expedition of the Long March, the building of Soviet bases, and the unification of the country to fight against Japanese aggression, and beginning to build a country that could stand up after it had been beaten down. Moreover, Du Bois understood the significance of China's revolution for the masses of poor and oppressed in America and of the world, for it had reshaped economic, social, and political life, touching upon questions such as industry, education, and governance. It is the same reason China is seen as an existential threat to the Western order. Second, his commitment to truth and his belief in the unity between America and China. Between Du Bois's two trips to China, one in 1936 and the other in 1959, he had been invited to China twice, once in 1946 and the other in 1956. The sentiment of the Chinese people was represented by a letter by Sun Qingling, which she had written to Du Bois in 1958. Quote, we feel that the common people of one land should work with and help the common people of others. Their plights and struggles are synonymous. One section of the world does not succeed or suffer without affecting the other. End quote. Both times the US had not permitted him to visit China, and even on his 1959 trip, his passport stated, quote, "Not good for travel to China," end quote. However, in the midst of dominant hysteria, Du Bois sought to know the truth of China unhindered and to tell it not for the ruling elite that were propagandizing war and hostility, but rather for the working masses of the world that could benefit from China's revolutionary experiments. Du Bois writes in Russian America, quote, "China is inconceivable. Here first, a man out of the empty West realizes where the population of the world really centers. Never before has a land so affected me. For Africa, I had more emotion, a greater wave of understanding and recognition. But China to the wayfarer of a little week, and I suspect of a little year, is incomprehensible. I have, of course, a theory and explanation which brings some vague meaning to the mass of things I have seen and heard. But I understand now as never before how I have mistrusted human history and missed the whole meaning of a people. And this I know. Any attempt to explain the world without giving China a place of extraordinary prominence is futile. Perhaps the riddle of the universe will be settled in China, and if not, in no part of the world which ignores China." End quote. In China, Du Bois saw the potential for unity between the revolutionary forces of both the United States and of China, for both American black workers and the Chinese workers. Their common enemy are war and poverty, and both, whether the black worker during Reconstruction or the Chinese worker in the Long March, showed that they would struggle. In the current times of American society, in which poverty exists next to extreme wealth, in which wars between nations are promoted so carelessly, in which people are depressed and anxious about their and their children's futures, we should look to Du Bois for a path forward. In the past century, America has been the greatest purveyor of violence against the American people and those of the world. We have a great and urgent responsibility to fulfill our claims of democracy and to call for peace and unity. Fortunately, as Du Bois shows, we have a rich American tradition to draw upon, both in the American Revolution and the Black Freedom Struggle, and a world tradition, including that of the Chinese Revolution, to learn from. Thank you.
Thank you for the beautiful presentation, Alice. Next, I would like to introduce Eunnuri, who will be discussing Fidel Castro's speech on President Xi Jinping.
In 1999, Fidel Castro reflected on the coming of the new millennium. He asked, "What year 2000 are we going to celebrate, and what kind of a new century will we live in?" He continued, The world will reach that 21st century with people living under New York bridges, wrapped in papers, while others amass enormous fortunes. There are many tycoons in that country, but the number of those living under bridges at the entrance of buildings or in slums is incomparably higher. In the United States, millions live in critical poverty, something in which the fanatic advocates of the economic order imposed upon humanity cannot take pride. This is a bleak image that is still too familiar today, yet Fidel had hope for the 21st century with the rise of China. For Fidel, the distinction between the people and the enemies of the people were clear. The most significant divisions of the world were not between races, religions, or cultures, but rather between those who supported imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism, and those who opposed all forces which suppressed the people and their development. Fidel's leadership, characterized by his undying faith and confidence in the people, and his commitment to the battle of ideas, results in the clarity and the strong unity of the Cuban people, but also in a selfless and principled internationalism, which I believe has new relevance for our times as we struggle to free ourselves from the 500-year-long age of Europe to finally achieving the age of humanity, an age of free nations and people united and self-determining. Before the 1959 revolution, Cuba was a country dominated by American imperialism and the political corruption of the ruling class. American companies dominated the Cuban economy, treating it as a semi-colony, such that Cuba was a backyard playground for organized crime and wealthy Americans to use for gambling, drugs, and prostitution. The many country clubs and beaches enjoyed by tourists and the wealthy were strictly segregated, while in the countryside and sugarcane plantations, abject poverty was common, and only around 2% of the population had attained an education beyond the 5th grade level. The 1961 literacy campaign in the Cuban Revolution, which had the goal of eradicating illiteracy in the span of just 8 months, paved the way to the new Cuba, united around the ideals of the revolution. 100,000 teenage volunteers left school to live and work in the countryside. Before their departure, Fidel told them, quote, "You are going to teach, but at the same time you will learn. You will learn much more than you teach. They will teach you the why of the revolution better than any book. The people will teach you how living creatures had to suffer under exploitation from selfish interests. They will teach you what it is to have lived without sufficient food. They will teach you what it is to live without doctors and hospitals. They will teach you at the same time what is a healthy, sound, clean life, what is upright morality, duty, generosity, sharing the little they have with visitors. And when you come back, you will be better citizens, better revolutionaries." The literacy campaign, like the campaigns of the Red Army, won the masses of people to the revolution while developing its participants around its core values. It firmly set the moral foundation and principles of the new Cuban people's democracy for the generations to come. Fidel said, "The children of those people who could not read or write developed such a high consciousness that they shed their sweat and even their blood for other people's, in short, for any people in the world." End quote. Over 500,000 Cubans took part in internationalist missions over the last 60 years, participating directly in the Angolan liberation struggle, for example. Doctors went to serve the people where there are no physicians and where other physicians would not go, whether in Suriname, remote mountain areas, or even in the Canadian Arctic Circle. Fidel highlights just one example. Once, when Nicaragua requested 1,000 teachers, later they asked for more. We invited volunteers and 30,000 offered. Then, when the bandits organized and supplied by the United States, who waged that dirty war against the Sandinistas, murdered some of our teachers, 100,000 volunteered to go. That is why I am discussing ideas. That is why I am discussing consciousness. That is why I believe what I am saying and why I believe in mankind. Because when so many of our fellow countrymen and women went or were ready to go to those places, consciousness and the idea of solidarity and internationalism proved to be a mass phenomenon. End quote. Out of all the world figures, I really feel that Fidel exemplified the principle of international solidarity, and that even today, he's a beacon for that the people of so many other countries look to. The Cuban Minister of Foreign Affairs, Felipe Perez Roque, wrote that, quote, "Fidel's internationalist mission was to transform Cuba from a tiny island lost in the sea into solid ground for all who struggle for justice and honor anywhere in the world." End quote. He was a leader not just of Cuba, but of the world's struggle against imperialism, and one of the great fighters and believers in the ideological struggle. Fidel gave this speech on the Battle of Ideas, also known as "A Revolution Cannot Be Born Without Culture and Ideas," in 1999 in Venezuela, shortly after the election of Hugo Chavez. This was coming out of Cuba's special period of economic hardship after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But Fidel's analysis of the time was that actually, although the collapse of the Soviet bloc had indeed caused great difficulty for Cuba, the neoliberal American policies of globalization had also created economic crisis for the West, and that the high and mighty, those who thought they had created a system or an empire that would last 1,000 years, were beginning to realize that the foundations of that system, of that empire, are falling apart, end quote. Fidel concludes that this contradiction was a great weakness for the West, causing, quote, "confusion and even despair." In the crisis of the Western world order, Fidel was confident that the deciding force of history would be the decisive will of the people and their collective unity through high political awareness. He said that despite the onslaught of the economic blockade and the ideological attacks of the imperialists, that, quote, they have been unable to defeat a united people, a people armed with just ideas, a people endowed with a great political consciousness, because that is most important for us. We have resisted everything and are ready to continue resisting for as long as necessary, thanks to the seeds planted throughout those decades, thanks to the ideas and the consciousness developed during that time. This has been our greatest weapon, and it shall remain so, even in nuclear times. And so beginning in the 1990s and into the beginning of the new millennium, around the same time as the Battle of Ideas speech, Fidel begins to speak more and more emphatically on China as the country of the 21st century, the country of the future, as well as, quote, the most promising hope and the best example for all third world countries. What he says is very interesting, I think, and very useful for us. In a 1994 interview, when Fidel was asked, "Do you think China is an example that must be followed?" Fidel responded, "It is an experiment that must be studied." The Chinese themselves say that no one should automatically imitate what others are doing. They criticize themselves for mechanically applying the Soviet experience during its first years. But if you want to talk about socialism, let us not forget what socialism achieved in China. At one time, it was a land of hunger, poverty, disasters. Today, there is none of that. Today, China can feed, dress, educate, and care for the health of 1.2 billion people. There are no fully pure regimes or systems. In Cuba, for instance, we have many forms of private property. We have hundreds of thousands of farm owners. In Europe, they would be considered large landholders. Practically all Cubans own their own home, and what is more, we welcome foreign investment. But that does not mean that Cuba has stopped being socialist, end quote. So Fidel evaluates China not in terms of lofty abstractions or dogmas about socialism, as is common among our left, but in terms of its concrete achievements and its undeniable impact on the real lives of 1 billion people freed from imperialist exploitation with the Chinese Revolution, and 700 million people lifted out of poverty in the span of a single lifetime. Basically, he evaluates in terms of whether China is working to achieve the fundamental goals of socialism. This question is not, is China socialist, but rather, what has China done for its people? And what can the Chinese experiment teach us? In 2004, when President Hu Jintao visited Cuba, Fidel honored him with the Order of Jose Marti, and in his speech reiterated his admiration of China, the need to learn by its example, and the importance of creative synthesis for each country to chart its own path based on its unique conditions. He said then, quote, "The Communist Party and the people of the People's Republic of China have irrefutably demonstrated, as Cuba and other brotherly countries have shown, that each people must adapt their strategy and revolutionary objectives to the concrete conditions of their own country, and that there are not two absolutely equal socialist revolutionary processes. From each of them, you can take the best experiences and learn from each of their most serious mistakes. China has objectively become the most promising hope and the best example for all third world countries. I do not hesitate to say that it is already the main engine of the world economy. In what time? In only 83 years after the foundation of its glorious Communist Party, and 55 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China." End quote. Firstly, Fidel's approach to understanding China, like the 1981 report of the CPC's assessment of the Cultural Revolution that Emily presented on yesterday, is very measured and self-reflective. It's grounded in the desire to draw conclusions as lessons to better serve the people and build the revolutionary process. This is the approach of the true revolutionary. Second, I also think that these two quotes speak to what Doc was saying yesterday about Mao and the Chinese Revolution's strivings to find a Chinese essence in applying the theories of Lenin and Marx. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, as Deng put it, is not something that can be exported, which I believe Xi Jinping also emphasizes in China's internationalist approach today. Rather, as Fidel says, each country should study and synthesize creatively, developing independently along a potentially unique revolutionary trajectory, but while still learning from the commonalities of world history and ultimately uniting towards a shared global community. By 2014, just 2 years before Fidel's passing, Xi Jinping visited Cuba, and Fidel declared, "Xi Jinping is one of the most strongest and most capable revolutionary leaders I have met in my life. also presenting him with the Order of Marty. This was when he said, the quote from the Declaration, quote, "I feel a profound affection for the Chinese people, an undying admiration because of their millennia of history, personal qualities, love of independence and freedom, the heroic struggles in the face of interventions and colonialism, and for the efforts they have made over 100 years to attain liberation, for the work they are currently conducting, for the great economic successes they are reaching, for the stability that they have achieved. For that reason, I realize that China is the country of the 21st century. It is the country of the future because of its human potential, natural resources, scientific potential, the talent of its children, and the hardworking spirit of the people. I believe that in the 21st century, China will be the giant that arises." China and Cuba have had a long and beautiful friendship with deep connections over the years. Cuba was actually the first Latin American country to establish diplomatic relations with the PRC in September of 1960. Just a few months later, China sent oil lanterns to Cuba so that the brigadistas in the literacy campaign could teach and that students could study by night after the day's work was done. Both Fidel and Xi Jinping have remarked on the special quality of this relationship. When Xi Jinping visited Cuba, he reflected, quote, "This relationship has stood the test of constant changes in the international landscape and set an example of unity and cooperation between developing countries. Cuban national hero Jose Marti said, quote, 'To be united, this is the word of the world,' end quote. China and Cuba are good friends, good comrades, and good brothers who share the same visions and beliefs," end quote. The longstanding example of Cuban-Chinese friendship and the connections between Fidel's internationalism and Xi Jinping's philosophy of win-win international relations offers, I think, one bright possibility for the future of international relations with the rise of China. The possibility that the relations between countries could in general be characterized by friendly cooperation, brotherhood, and unity, as opposed to being the exception to the rule under the current system of imperialist hegemony, competition, division, and war. It's another huge task to begin to try to understand Xi Jinping's leadership and what it means as a new era for China. And so thankfully, I will leave that to the next panelists. But I just wanted to share a small piece of what Xi Jinping is saying in this time about China's philosophy of international relations and how well it fits in with the historical current of ideas that Fidel, the Chinese Revolution, and the world anti-colonial struggle were all enmeshed in. In 2015, at the Bois Forum for Asia, Xi Jinping gave the keynote speech entitled "Towards a Community of Common Destiny and a New Future for Asia," in which he commemorated the 60th anniversary of the Bandung Conference to discuss the cause of peace and development in Asia and the world. In it, Xi said, quote, "Asia belongs to the world. To build a community of common destiny, we need to make sure that all countries respect one another and treat each other as equals. Countries may differ in size, strength, or the level of development, but all are equal members of the international community with equal rights to participate in regional and international affairs. Being a big country means shouldering greater responsibilities for regional and world peace and development, as opposed to seeking greater monopoly over regional and world affairs. To respect one another and treat each other as equals, countries need to first and foremost respect other countries' social systems and development paths of their choice, respect each other's core interests and major concerns, and have objective and rational perception of other countries' growing strength, policies, and visions. Effort should be made to seek common ground while shelving differences, and better still, to increase common interests. To build a community of common destiny, we need to ensure inclusiveness and mutual learning among civilizations, each adding its own splendor to the progress of human civilization. Mencius, the great philosopher in ancient China, said, quote, "Things are born to be different. Civilizations are unique and no one is superior to the other. There needs to be more exchange and dialogue among civilizations and development models, so that each can draw on the strength of the other and all could thrive and prosper by way of mutual learning and common development. Let us promote intercivilizational exchanges to build bridges of friendship for our people, drive human development, and safeguard the peace of the world." Unquote. So this community of common destiny for mankind as a key slogan for China's international relations in the new emerging era under Xi Jinping. in some ways possibly looks like the fulfillment of so many revolutionary dreams and ideas we talk about in the Free School. It recognizes Fidel's assessment of China and Cuba as countries with particular contexts, conditions, and a unique essence to contribute to the world revolution. It follows Du Bois and The World in Africa, who wrote, quote, "No culture whose greatest effort must go to suppress some of the strongest contributions of mankind can have left in itself strength for survival. War which typifies suppression and death can never support a lasting culture. Peace and tolerance is the only path to eternal progress. Europe can never survive without Asia and Africa as free and interrelated civilizations in the world," end quote. The community of common destiny for mankind draws on China's 5 principles of coexistence from the Bandung era. It echoes Martin Luther King Jr.'s insistence that all life is interrelated, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so I think I've more opened up a large can of worms and questions, and there are more questions than clear answers and not much to conclude with total finality. But I think this much is clear. Today in the 21st century, the key division of the world is still between humanity and the enemies of the people, which are war, poverty, and imperialism. But we're also at a crossroads, perhaps, between the countries and people who look to the shared future and uplift of humanity in the 21st century. Those who want clarity of ideas, are willing to engage and study and struggle, and thus have good faith and sincere hope in China, versus the cynics and the nihilists who cling more viciously and desperately to the decaying rule of the old world order based on war, competition, exploitation, and degradation, and stubbornly refuse to face the future. We don't know yet what will come of the community of common destiny for mankind, but if China does manage to follow through in action to make good on its new promises, as it has made good on its promises to its own people to lift 700 million out of poverty in less than a century, if it manages to make good and to stand as a civilization of respect and human values, then it will be a huge leap towards finally fulfilling the century-long dream of the world anti-colonial revolutionary freedom struggles that Fidel, King, and Du Bois played such great roles in. And if China does manage to make good on its promises, it will surely be a great victory for humanity in this 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Nori. One of the things that I've been finding very significant about our presentations thus far is the maturity in which Nori and Alice have approached their presentations with. And the approach comes from humility and wanting to learn first rather than judging or assuming. And it made me think how often we hear these accusations that say these countries such as the People's Republic of China, Cuba, or Vietnam are selling out, or that they're turning into capitalist countries. But I think this is very much a different approach because you can't understand, you can't judge where someone is going if you don't know where they came from. And you can't judge where someone is going if you don't know the sacrifices that their people have made. Sacrifices that to many average Americans are unfathomable. But with this approach that Alice and Nuri have been presenting with, I believe it gives people the opportunity to learn. Because to say that these countries are sellouts is to evade your own responsibility. And I think I'm just looking forward to Purba's presentation, which will be about the forged connections between India and China through the anti-colonial movement.
Good morning. In my presentation, I'm going to attempt to thank you. I'm going to attempt to give a historical perspective of the relationship between India and China in order to guide thought and furnish hope for future. Um, the historical ties between India and China must be reckoned not in decades or centuries, but in thousands of years. Rahul Sankrityayan, one of India's greatest scholars, has written extensively on the ancient civilizational belt from Egypt to China that these two great countries of Asia were a part of. The Southern Silk Road, which forged economic ties between them, also served as an avenue for the exchange of ideas and philosophies. Most significant of these was the spread of Buddhism from India to China and other parts of Asia in the 1st century AD. This was an age of spirited collaboration, seeking to reach a new synthesis of Indian and Chinese thought and leaving its mark directly or indirectly on the culture and economic development of all parts of Asia. Although forged by Buddhism, the civilizational ties between India and China went far beyond religion. Indian influences in Chinese art and literature in the 4th and 5th centuries tells us that China, though as culturally advanced, was willing to learn from Indian traditions. They met as equals, two great and ancient peoples devoted to the cause of universal truth and the fulfillment of human destiny. For a millennium, they coexisted without conflict, which points beyond the difficult terrain that separated them towards an essential commitment to peace that is the mark of great civilizations. These cultural ties diminished with the decline of Buddhism and deteriorated further with the subsequent violent colonization of Asia by Europe. The early 20th century, however, saw a resurgence of an Asian identity rooted in the anti-colonial movements of Asia and Africa. The devastation caused by the two world wars, fought primarily for imperial control over colonies, exposed the moral bankruptcy of Western political theories. The anti-colonial movement grew out of the struggle for political independence and self-determination of colored humanity. In each country, it strove to uplift the spiritual and material realities of the working masses and to develop a new national consciousness based on civilizational roots. It also sought for principled unity among Asians and Africans against the inhumane white supremacist world order, which had plunged the colored world into poverty and war. It was in the context of this great movement of movements that the bond of friendship and solidarity between India and China was rejuvenated. Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian poet and philosopher, was the living embodiment of this reawakening. He recognized the common humanity of the Indian and Chinese people. On his first visit to China in 1924, he carried with him the message of peace and brotherhood. He proclaimed his belief in the ideal of a united Asia, resisting the self-seeking materialism of the West through the moral force of love and spirituality. At a time when the conflict of traditional values with modernity was at the forefront of the national consciousness in both countries, he rejected the identification of modernity with Westernization. Pointing towards the emphasis on universal truth and love in ancient Chinese and Indian philosophy, he asserted, quote, "All true things are ever modern and can never become obsolete," end quote. He equated civilization not with the mechanical progress of the West, but with dharma, or the moral imperative, which, quote, binds humanity and leads to the best possible welfare, end quote, which that was the legacy of the East. The Republic of India under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and the People's Republic of China under Chairman Mao Zedong came into being within a year of each other. Nehru recognized the commonality of the Indian and Chinese struggle as free nations, both poor countries with large and predominantly agrarian populations in need of rapid industrialization and agricultural reforms to raise the standard of living. He extended the hand of friendship to China, firmly believing that their unity was key to the revival of Asia and the ushering in of an era of peace after the ravages of war and 2 centuries of colonial exploitation. This was the vision of the Asian Relations Conference conceived by Nehru in 1946 and organized in India in the March of 1947. As early as April 1950, India established formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. India's ambassador to New China, K.M. Panikkar, recorded his impression of the Central People's Government as being run by, quote, men and women who were efficient and honest, who knew their minds and were prepared to put their best into the service of the state, end quote. In his talks with Mao, the latter acknowledged the common traditions of the two countries and also their common struggle to recover freedom from foreign aggression. It was agreed upon by both parties that this freedom was threatened by the entrenchment of European economic power in Asia and that India and China needed to develop their own resources in response. Panikkar described the new regime as committed to the upliftment of the working masses, with great emphasis laid on education and village reforms, but also on bringing beauty and recreation and a new spirit into the lives of common people. Nehru's commitment to principled unity with China was reflected in his prioritizing the legitimate admission of the PRC into the United Nations over the question of India's own membership. It was he who brought China to the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian Unity in 1955, in April 1955. The Bandung Conference upheld the right of the colored world to determine their own political and economic destinies and resolved to lift the globally deprived from poverty and illiteracy. It adopted a resolution of mutual respect and cooperation, building on Panchsheel, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence laid out by India and China in 1954. The Bandung spirit was the very spirit of our anti-colonial struggle and its faith in the agency of the darker masses of humanity to create a new world free from oppression and war. The anti-colonial movement has, however, remained unfinished due to the counter-revolution of Western imperialism. Today, the rewriting of world history to exclude Africa and diminish Asia, coupled with neo-colonial exploitation and war, has once again plunged us into economic, cultural, and intellectual servitude to the West. In these times of deep ideological confusion, the narrative of India-China relations is dictated not by the 1,000 years of friendship and peaceful coexistence, but by their recent history of conflicts, which are the troubled inheritances of a post-colonial world. Western propaganda, with the self-serving interest of maintaining the status quo, fans the flame of anti-China sentiments. China is authoritarian, they say, and India must defend its democracy lest it go the same way. What is sad is that some Indian intellectuals, still to recover from their colonial training, have often echoed this Western hysteria about a rising Chinese threat. This is why today, when President Xi Jinping is talking about reviving the Bandung spirit and rebuilding the civilizational and economic ties of the Silk Road through the Belt and Road Initiative, India has hesitated to answer his call. Instead, she has partnered with USA, Australia, and Japan through the Quad Alliance, countries she has very little in common with historically and culturally. Tagore has said, quote, "The most memorable fact of human history is that of a path opening, not for the clearing of a passage for machines or machine guns, but for helping the realization by races of their affinity of minds, their mutual obligation of a common humanity," end quote. Such a path was created between the Indian and Chinese people 2,000 years ago, when they met as noble friends to exchange the best of their knowledge and cultural accomplishments. In stark contrast, the West came to us in war, not to learn and assimilate, but to subjugate and exploit, and to establish their dominance and superiority over the colored world. Those Indians that see in China a threat and in the West a principled ally would do well to remember the evidence of history. India should strengthen its commitment to regional peace and collaboration through a closer engagement with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. The ASEAN countries are invested in good relations with both India and China, and unlike India's partners in the Quad Alliance, seek not to contain China, but to maintain a balance of powers in the Indo-Pacific in the interest of fruitful economic and cultural cooperation and the maintenance of peace. We must remember that while India and China might have adopted different political ideologies for the fulfillment of their national destinies, the, excuse me, the Indian and Chinese people are bound by the common humanity of their civilizational histories, a bond that is older and stronger than nationalism. The greatest threat to democracy is not authoritarianism, but the brutality of poverty. The great task before India today is to raise the masses of poor that make up most of its population into lives of dignity and fulfillment. In this, we have much to learn from China's remarkable success in extreme poverty alleviation through state action. We must also recognize in the Chinese national project the fundamental hope of our own freedom struggle, that a people united can transform society and make essential contributions to the progress of humanity as a whole. Today, the West is in the thralls of a deep political and economic crisis, and a viable alternative to the Western world order is being presented by an economically and technologically ascending China. This is a world historic moment ripe with possibilities, and India must decide which side she stands on. We must reflect on the past and draw deep from the well of history so that through principled unity, India and China can once again revitalize Asia, both materially and culturally. Together, they are home to a third of the world's youth, a storehouse of energy and potential waiting to be unleashed, 600 million young minds waiting to be lifted into the realm of true freedom. In them and in young people everywhere rests the future of mankind. It is the work of our times to channel their creativity, idealism, and innate goodness into the service of humanity through an inspired synthesis of our ancient wisdom with the spirit of modern times. We must instill in them the firm belief that true strength lies not in mechanical force and self-assertion, but in the spirit of struggle and sacrifice for peace, and that true freedom is to be found not in material seekings and individual liberties, but in the moral imperative that binds us together in a common humanity and seeks the broadest measure of justice for all. We must inspire in our people a renewed faith in the unfulfilled dream of our anti-colonial struggle, that out of Asia and Africa can emerge the vision for a more human world order that places at the center of its concern not wealth and power, but the hopes and aspirations of the masses. As today we celebrate the centenary of the Communist Party of China, we harbor great hope for the future and great faith that India and China will answer the call of the times, not as two nations divided by political ideologies, but as one people with common roots dedicated to this vision of a new and better world. Thank you.
All right, and that concludes our panel. Now we will be starting a discussion. So we can start with any questions or comments by people in the audience. There's a microphone over there, so.
Thank you for those excellent presentations. And on the note in which Purba ended, maybe I would like to ask the panel, can you, some of you say a little more about how, what is the role of these kinds of Western ideological interventions in particularly in the Asian countries, regarding China, both historically and today? And how do you see the role of the kinds of ideas which you presented, which are giving a very different perspective? Because I asked that question because I think this is one of the serious challenges in this moment where you're talking about the rise of China and the possibility of the rise of Asia, certainly an economic rise of Asia, but in order for there to be a political rise, a civilizational rise, I think that this problem has to be dealt with and we struggle for broader unity.
I actually had a quote that I was going to include in my presentation, but didn't. But this is a quote from Du Bois in 1936 when he talks about the relationship between Japan and China. Because in 1936, Japan hadn't launched a full-scale invasion yet. And I think Du Bois had a bit of hope in terms of Japan being able to not ape the West and mimic essentially the colonialism and imperialism tendencies that the West has had. Unfortunately, history didn't go that way, and that's why you had, I guess, the Communist Party of China and the events that ensued. But I think the reason why Du Bois had talked about Japan and China was because they're both Asian countries with long historical and civilizational ties, where people have flowed between these two countries, traditions, religions. And I think the situation is similar today, where Asian countries themselves can choose to define what it means to be an Asian country that has a shared history and civilization, or it can choose to be on the side of the West, where you do see in instances nowadays.
To that question, I think one of the biggest weapons in this Western ideological control is a negation of history. And once you do a serious study of history, like of the anti-colonial struggle and the relationships between nations historically, it becomes easier to identify the lies that are that Western propaganda tries to perpetuate through time in order to divide people. And this is, I mean, at the Western University is also a big part of this project of negating history and flipping the narrative on its head, so that you forget who have been your friends through time and who have been the aggressors. I think that's what I would want to say.
Yeah, I think in terms of the ideological interventions, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 things. Like, one is the exportation of culture, which I think is the ideology that the West is the best and that the West has constituted everything that is progressive about civilization. And I think it encourages a kind of, I guess, internal racism where Asian countries distrust Asian countries, but actually for the same reasons that they should really be distrusting the West. And I think also in the trajectory of the 20th century, you've seen America try to wiggle its way more and more into Asia, where now also you're able to leverage the threat of war on Asian territory to split Asian countries apart, with the presence of military bases in Japan, Korea, really all over the Asia Pacific. And I think also one characteristic of these ideological interventions of the West, which I think you can also see in Cuba with the small protests that recently happened, you can see again the exportation of culture, and I think the heavy lifting of hip hop culture and the sort of terrible subversion of the idea like fatherland or death, where instead it's turned into fatherland and life. and the use of identity politics again to divide the people and to turn them against one another. But really, I think the most tragic thing of all of these interventions is that because, like Purba said, it's a completely ahistorical fiction that it takes so much energy to continue to try to maintain, that the United States is so focused on fabricating essentially its opinion or the way that it presents itself to the world, that it has no energy left over to actually deal with its own internal contradictions. For instance, I feel like there's so much propaganda sort of decrying the Belt and Road Initiative as being, I don't know, a tool of Chinese imperialism or something like that. But all of that is really just meant to distract from our own crumbling infrastructure and the fact that there is not even any plan or really any capacity to address it realistically. And so I think the ideological interventions are trying to divide the people of Asia, but then also to distract the people of America from the really pressing questions and the things that we need to deal with in our own country.
This issue of war is very, very important. And I think that it seems that the West is bent on starting another war. They need it. They're very invested. The United States is very invested in its military. So I'd like you to speak more about that and how our experience, our recent experience in Afghanistan and Iraq and with North Korea. It was a very interesting thing between our president and the North Korean country recently, how that all played out and how it's playing out now with the new administration. But in particular, this real need for the capitalist West to have a shooting war going on in some place.
I guess something that is different with China is this concept that we've been talking about over the past, I guess, week or so, which is this multipolar world that China poses, where I think even when Du Bois talks about China at that time, like China then is not China now, where the US and China, even though there are politicians that are adding to the antagonism, there is also an undeniable piece where China is so inextricably tied up with the rest of the world right now, whether it's politically or economically. And I think even with, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, Italy's participating, and it's not Italy you would think of as a Western country in the past, World War I, World War II. But now I think a lot of countries are having to grapple with the fact that China itself is not weak as it was back then. And it does pose a serious mirror to the West of having to deal with its own issues. And so I think ultimately the question in terms of war, it is something that is not to be taken lightly. But at the same time, what the US has to face is not China itself, but I think something that we've consistently talked about, which is itself, like the US itself. What does it mean to be, I guess, the US or America? What is it going to define itself by? And that's in all aspects of itself. But I think that's all I would add.
Question fully formulated, but I just am so impressed and so appreciative of the presentations and the hard work that went into preparing them and how they are really a contribution to the discussion and the ideological clarity for the moment in which we live and the future that we hope to build. Having said that, the spirit of Bandung is infused through all of the presentations, including Brandon, your introduction. And it seems at the core of Bandung is the concept of the right to self-determination, a right that even up to this day, the West and especially the United States does not acknowledge as a right for the nations of the darker world. You know that President Biden has this idea of a rules-based international order, and many commentators have criticized it as an attack upon international law. And a central foundation of modern international law is the right to self-determination, which is not only political self-determination, which defined the first stage of the anti-colonial struggle, including in China. If I might just say this, China went quickly from the political right to self-determination to the substance of the right to self-determination in economic self-determination. And that is why it thus became an enemy of the West. Not because it declared itself an enemy, but because the West declared the processes of the consolidation of the revolution as a threat to the West. Having said that, I was very impressed with this idea of ideas and how ideas are shaping world relationships and relationships between peoples. And that, you know, even with the new technology, information technology, the rapidity with which ideas move from one part of the world or from one nation to others is something that we have never seen, humanity has never seen. And I was very impressed, Purba, with your emphasis upon the, I think you said 600 million youth. Is that the number that you gave? I think that might be a bit of an underestimate. But certainly, this vast number of young people that constitute a great weight just by their numbers, their quantity, but have the capacity to qualitatively reshape humanity and world relationships if they are on the right side of history. And of course, India, as we've talked so many times, India, the Indian intelligentsia and Indian young people are very similar to American young people in the sense, sadly, of their not yet having consolidated where they will stand in history, the great ideological question. And there's more ideological confusion. I guess what I want to ask is that how do you all see the rise of China and its, we have to admit, surpassing the United States? And in fact, the United States will take decades now to catch up to where China will be in just another decade. How do you see the rise of China as an ideological force, as a force reshaping ideological relations and intellectual and indeed civilizational relationships among peoples? And especially, I guess I'm asking you, Purba, India, which certainly in the very, I know I'm a little long-winded, in the very near future will be the largest population on the planet.
So I really, from preparing for this presentation, the reading that I was doing, all of that makes me believe, strongly believe that this is the work of our times. And it's not just that automatically, just looking at the rise of China, there will be a sudden, turnaround in the Indian consciousness. But that is the work of our times. That is what we have to do, and that will come through a reinterpretation and revisiting our own history, and to shift the emphasis of what we value from, something like individual liberties or just celebrity or just climbing up the ladder in academic success or whatever, to valuing what is essential and what is eternal in in like our civilizational principles, which is what finally connects the Indian and Chinese people. I mean, as nations, there can always be rivalries where you think that one country can only do well at the expense of others. But this has not been our historical experience. And the reason we think like this is because of what we were talking about a little while back, which is this ideological control of the West, which shifts our focus of values from these essential principles to individual liberties and material seekings and so on and so forth. And looking at the numbers that I was giving, I think you're right. Maybe it's an underestimation, but 1/3, in any case, 1/3 of people, 1/3 of youth live in India and China. If you consider all of Asia, that's an unimaginable number. And it is really the work of our times to to have this switch on what you value. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to rephrase that. It is the work of our times to make this switch from what we value, from being able to say whatever we want to say or do whatever we want to do, to valuing truth and peace. And peace also, and this is related to the last question, I think it is a mark of civilization. Throughout history, only the civilized societies have valued peace, and the barbarians have come in war. We have to remember this. This is the work of our times, to make this switch of values to happen. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but that's what I would say. Would you like
I just wanted to follow up, if you don't mind. In India and in China, a huge number of intellectuals, especially in the hard sciences, but not exclusively in the hard sciences, have been educated and are being educated in the United States and in other Western countries, but primarily the United States. Being educated in the United States, even if it is in the hard sciences, carries with it certain values, certain ideological predispositions. And I was just, wondering how you see that phenomenon going forward in India. And I would ask Alice and Eunnuri, of course, how they see the impact of Western educated Chinese and Korean intellectuals impacting the values of the young generation.
before I hand it over to Nuri and Alice, I would just like to say that I think um, when Indians come to be educated at Western universities, they lose a connection with their own history and they lose a connection with their own people. And I don't, through no fault of their own. It's just how this works, and the effort is to divert, like I was saying, their idealism and innate need to change the world into synthetic movements and valuing things like identity politics and um, again individual liberties over what is good for the people and what ties people together. um, I don't know what the answer to the question, how do we change this, or how, what are we to do about this problem that we know exists is. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it is conversations like this and organizations like the Free School and conferences such as this, where we build ideas, an ideological base for the future, for how to go about the future, how to do what is the best for people. This is the work that needs to be done. I think, I think that's what I'd like to say.
Well, I think in Korea, the trajectory of, I guess, the intellectuals has, well, been very much shaped by the Korean War and then also the relationship of the United States to Korea. And because it's very much a neocolonialist relationship, I think that the way that the United States has literally exported the values of the West, the value of a Western education also applies very directly. But I also think that, I guess in regards to your previous question about how we see the rise of China as an ideological force shaping the world, I think that China, in its presentation of, I guess, a multipolar world, presents an opportunity for the Korean people to reflect on where they stand in the civilizational context. Do the last 70 or 100 years outweigh the 5,000 years of civilization and the relationships between the Asian countries? And I feel like also the rigor of the thinking of the Chinese Revolution and the party, like that in itself, I think stands in stark contrast to the actual education that you receive in the United States, which is essentially, I think, a retelling of propaganda. You're not really taught how to think. And so when Fidel was talking about the battle of ideas, I think it's that the people, public opinion ultimately will decide which ideas are powerful, which ideas are able to move the people, to mobilize them, and to actually, I guess, move people to the point where they're able to build a new society and to self-determine and to govern, not just for the stagnation or the bare maintenance of a society, but to actually creatively contribute something and to build towards the future. And so I think as time goes on and you see what the Chinese society is able to produce, you see the science or the ideas that it produces and what it's able to do for the people versus what is happening in America, where I think although a lot of Korean students are raised to believe that America is the most modern, the most advanced, and they go to the West in pursuit of this modernity, they're often quite disappointed, I think, in what Western modernity has actually brought to the people. And so I think with time, the truth will come out, essentially.
I'll just add briefly, in terms of, I think it's undoubtedly a fact that not even students from other countries coming to the US, but even students growing up, being born and raised in the US, face the similar question of, do you buy into what the West puts as one's life's purpose? Or is there something else to search for? And I think a lot of individuals, myself included, who come to the free school, I think have a disillusionment with what the West offers in terms of one's purpose. And I agree with Nuri in that for, like, time will often tell in terms of I think I forget who this comes from, but countries become communist not because like it's forced upon them. Actually, it's the conditions of people that push them towards trying to find an ideology that will uplift its people. I think a similar thing was seen in China, where in the early 1900s, there was a reform movement where many intellectuals that were studying abroad, including Sun Yat-sen, looked towards the West to adopt Western forms of, Western forms of democracy and governance. But with World War I and the violence that had erupted amongst Western countries, many intellectuals in China grew disillusioned with that system. And that's why actually with the Russian Revolution, but also with the simultaneously decline of the West in that period, individuals within China turned towards communism and studying communism. And it didn't start as, like the Communist Party that we see today, which is 95 million people. It started with like 1 to 2 individuals that were translating works from the Soviet Union and then starting study groups that were like 10 to like 20 people, which eventually became 50. And they were studying these ideas so that they could improve the conditions of the country. And I think for a lot of I guess this is not short, but I guess for many individuals within the US or who come to the US, I think a question that ultimately everyone is faced with is, what is your responsibility towards? Is it just towards yourself, or is it from the society that you come from, or the society or the world that you're a part of? And I think that's the difficult task ahead that Purba is referring to. With the decline of the West and this rise of China, I think individuals are in a special period in history where they are faced with that decision. And time will tell as well where the tides will shift.
Yeah, the whole world has been watching in amazement with the material progress that China has made and the way they've been able to develop the country and raise the standard of living. But I like the emphasis that you put about the untapped potential of the youth. And so I'd like you guys to be able to expand a little bit more on the progress they're making in human development, how they're able to and will continue to raise human spirit, moral character, and human culture.
Well, I think for me, it goes back to the distinction ultimately between, I guess, the West and the rest of humanity, which is, I'm thinking of a Du Bois quote where he says that Europe only ever saw the body of man, whereas Asia and Africa saw the stars. And I think that's the difference. The West has focused solely on profit or on material goods or on, I guess, material objects, whereas in these anti-colonial revolutions, the most valuable, the most precious thing is a human life and the capacity of human beings to develop and to bring something not just to themselves, but to future generations, which is what Du Bois is saying with the immortal child. And I think also what was exemplified in the Red Army, where if a single soldier was left behind, they were just as valuable as any other officer or any person on the Long March, and that if they were left behind, they should be politically strong enough to be able to develop all the people in the village and to build and to recruit, I guess, more people to the revolution. And I feel like that's something that you also saw in the Cuban Revolution. The quote that I gave in my presentation about how the children of those who couldn't read or write became scientists, became teachers, became doctors. And they did it not just to earn a lot of money or to gain great acclaim in their careers, but they did it so that they could teach children across the world, so that they could heal children who didn't have access to healthcare. And I think when we talk about, I guess, creative potential or what democracy means, it's, I think, a kind of creativity that is limitless. The contributions that people can make to humanity are limitless. And it's in such complete, stark contrast to the West, which doesn't believe in anything beyond the individual man or the individual lifetime.
I guess the only thing I would add is a question that actually came up yesterday in terms of where does truth come from, and like how do you find truth in such periods of ideological confusion? Something that we've been talking about as well is just the revolution of values that King talks about. I guess a question is where that revolution of values will come from. And it seems like from the conversations we've been having in the past weeks is that unity is really important to truth. Where in the Cuban literacy campaigns that Eunnuri was referring to, there were teachers, but there were also students. And there were teachers that came, I think, mostly from the cities and were more educated. At the same time, Fidel said, you'll learn just as much from those in the rural countryside because they'll teach you what it means to live a dignified life. And to feel and to be honest individuals. And I think it's a similar thing in the US nowadays, where unity is not the priority of many individuals that claim themselves to be revolutionaries. Where if actually you had unity in this country, there would be a potential for people, whether it's educated college students or workers, to learn from each other. Like learn what it means to, Fidel never also patronized those who didn't have an education. He said it's important for those who don't have an education to read. At the same time, you also need students or teachers that will be able to learn to how to have a dignified life and to live honestly. And that's something that I guess is an obstacle in the US right now, where there isn't a unity and there isn't a dialogue between those who actually know the life worlds of normal working people and those who are claiming to be revolutionaries or the vanguard of revolutionaries. That's the only thing I would add.
I'd like to read some one comment and one question from our Facebook live stream. The comment is from Alicia Klein. She writes, as Brandon so clearly put, the humility of the panelists is key to being able to learn from China and the world. In a time when especially young Americans are obsessed with the self and corporations are peddling pride over self-respect, what do you think it would take to open young students' minds to a more humble approach of study and understanding the world around them? That's the first question. Should we go with that? And then I'll do the second one? Maybe it was partially answered. I don't want to add it. Okay, so I'll read the second question then. This is from Shantanu Ghosh. He writes, what does a country like India or even the United States need in order to establish socialism with its own unique characteristics? Are we just in need of good leadership, more specific structural changes in the political framework, or both?
I think, well, I can try to answer this question. If I'm thinking about India, I think we need to define socialism as, I mean, just the definition would be different for a country like India with its scale and its diversity. And, you know, in defining it, we must think about what affords the broadest measure of justice to the people, you know, the masses of people which live in villages and make up most of India's population. And these are not questions that can be decided keeping in mind this tiny fraction of individuals or intellectuals that actually get an opportunity to speak about this. But if you go back to our freedom struggle and anti-colonial struggle, that was when, if I might say so, the last time the masses were united and they had agency in determining their destiny. So I would just like to say that these questions, of course, they need to be thought about, but they will not be answered in universities and by intellectuals. It will be, you need a leadership that would be able to connect with the masses and understand the reality of their situations, to define terms like democracy and socialism and so on.
Speaking about democracy, how do you think the rise of China and the uplift of the people by the CCP redefines what we think, or redefines what democracy is, and I guess the relationship between like the government and its people?
Sorry, what was your second question? The relationship between the government and its people? In terms of democracy, I think something that these 2 weekends have taught us is that democracy isn't what we think it is and what the West tells us it is, in terms of going to the polls and then every couple of months or half a year, you vote for someone who you don't really know too much about, and then the next cycle comes around. Instead, I think what we at the Saturday Free School have defined as democracy, or the opponent to democracy, as being poverty. I think even if you look at the US, poverty is the greatest obstacle for individuals to participate in, whether it's their families or in society or even governments as well. I think in our study of the Communist Party of China, what it's doing for democracy is that it's trying to uplift people from poverty so that they are able to make a livelihood, but also contribute to the communities, villages that they're part of, and to have, and this is in economic terms, but also in political, cultural livelihood, or in the political and cultural aspects of their lives. And I think that's not something that's unique to China, in that I think Du Bois, Fidel, everyone who we're studying say that poverty itself is something that actually unites the oppressed people of the world, where the vision that they're striving for is to eradicate poverty so that people are able to live to their potential of participating in communities. Is anyone in terms of the relationship of the party with its people, I think what we've learned as well is that no government really can rule sustainably without the social contract that it has with the people. I think the narrative that is told of the Communist Party of China is that the people themselves are brainwashed and the party itself dictates everything that goes on within the country. But that's actually really not the case, as seen by, last week when we saw the Panther Party delegation going to China, but also Du Bois going to China, Robeson going to China, where actually they see people who are very free. I think for many of us who have been to China, it's also true where you have some of the most vocal individuals, the most stubborn individuals, and it's the same as any society where you have a range of human personalities. What you're seeing actually in the US instead, and it's not to pose, to compare the two, but to elucidate the extremity, like the extremes of what happens when a social contract with its people is broken, where in the US, every couple of months or a year, you have protest uprising of sorts that seems endless and doesn't have a resolution. But in order for China to rule, it does have to address, I think what we've said before, is the very simple needs of people. How do you, like a society that is unable to address the simple needs of people is a society in crisis. And when we say simple needs, it's being able to feed your families, to have healthcare, to have a job that you feel dignified at. And so I think in studying the Communist Party of China, it very much does have that social contract with the people. And I know even personally for my family who's immigrated to the US, or my family who had immigrated to the US in the 90s, when they return to China, they see that China has changed so much in the years between in the 90s when they left and where they see it now, where they see subway systems being built for public transit, where they see individuals being able to, have tea in the park and dance in the park. And it's not that it doesn't come, that China doesn't come with its own issues, that it will have to address these disparities that come with development, but at least it has given some sort of hope in being able to answer the needs of its people and to be able to experiment and be flexible to do so. And I think that was exhibited by yesterday's presentations on the party itself and its leadership and being able to change and reflect on its history.
That will conclude our panel. Thank you.
Thank you to the moderator and panelists of our opening panel. With such a rich discussion, I think the last few questions bring us perfectly to our next panel, which focuses on continues our discussion on the Communist Party of China and its leadership and the ideology and theories behind it. And we will proceed with it in a few minutes. While we wait for a few minutes, the title of this panel is titled "The Evolution of the Communist Party of China, the Thought of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping," who are identified as the three prominent leaders of the Communist Party of China in its history. Dr. Anthony Montero, who will return shortly, is presenting on Mao Zedong. Jahanzeb Chaudhry will present on Deng Xiaoping, and Jeremiah Kim will present on Xi Jinping. And in totality, they will be addressing through the theories and ideologies of the leadership of the Communist Party of China. They will help us understand what will happen in this turn of epochs. And while we're all here and waiting, we will have lunch after this panel around 2 p.m. When the next panel concludes.